Dr. Ehrlich, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it. Is research and being a scientist what you expected and hoped it would be? What's similar, what's different about sort of your day-to-day and then maybe some of the big picture too?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so I love it. I mean, it is certainly the topic that both keeps me up at night and gets me going in the morning, is trying to tackle some of the big research questions and work on the studies that we're really focused on right now. In terms of what's different on a day-to-day basis, it's way more email than I was expecting. And I do feel like my time is a lot more fragmented than I would have expected. I think I had this vision of scientists as like, people who would just spend all day in a library or some overcrowded office and really poring over texts and thinking about data and, writing these, hard to read manuscripts. But the reality is, I am scheduled for back-to-back meetings for most of the days and trying to keep up with emails in between those meetings. And so in terms of like how much focused work time I have, that's probably the biggest day-to-day challenge, and also what's different than I had envisioned. But at the same time, what is really great about the role is just how much flexibility you have to pursue questions that interest you. And that was probably something I also didn't focus on a lot when I was going through my training. As a grad student and then even as a postdoc, you spend a lot of time working on projects that were likely established before you joined the lab, and hopefully you can carve out projects that will be uniquely yours and you can make a unique contribution to it, but you're still kind of working within the confines of what's already been established or planned for a study. And so now as a faculty member, to have kind of like to be the one to say what projects or what research questions we're going to explore is a lot of fun.
So when we think back of it to your own background, how do you think that might influence the way you operate as a researcher now? Do you ask questions with a certain lens in mind? Are there certain experiences you think that perhaps make you choose certain research questions or methodologies or others?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think that's always the joke about psychology, right? Is that there's a little bit of me search in every study. I benefited tremendously from really supportive parents who helped me navigate some tricky social experiences that I encountered in middle school and high school. And I remember thinking in the moment, but especially now looking back at some of those experiences, how lucky and how grateful I was to be able to go home and sort of digest what was happening at school and make sense of it and really kind of brainstorm, how was I going to tackle this fight or this, this challenge that I was facing. And I remember thinking at the time, like, what would I do if I didn't have that? Like, I'm a kid. I don't know how to make smart choices and rational decisions and solve conflicts on my own. So I think that had spurred some of my initial interest in thinking about how families and peers are connected and how families can do a lot to help or hinder kids' development. So that certainly was probably my initial motivation for studying that kind of work. And then more recently, I would say that interactions with participants have really driven subsequent questions that we've tackled. One example that comes to mind is for my dissertation, I used a structured conflict task that's pretty common, where you ask parents and kids to identify areas of disagreement in the relationship and try to resolve the conflict, and we record it and code those behaviors later on. And what I had not expected, but it turned out to happen quite a lot, was that parents and teens often didn't agree about what they disagreed about. And in ways that often became predictable over time, where a parent would say, no, we don't fight about homework, and the teen would say, yeah, we really disagree about homework. And so when they would have that topic that they would have to discuss, the parent would say, homework? Why did we get this? We don't disagree about the homework. And kids would say, yeah, that must have been an error. And you realize that that's why there's a discrepancy. It's not that they don't have an issue about that topic. It's that there's a lack of open communication, a lack of trust about having a difficult discussion. But that line of work that we've explored is, we refer to it as informant discrepancies. And that really came directly out of those interactions with families, where we were in the back room saying like, no, they definitely disagree about this. So.
That's really interesting. Are there ways that current events are also influencing the research questions you pursue, or how you think about applying the findings of your research studies?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we, currently now a lot of the work that I pursue with colleagues here at Georgia is focused on issues of discrimination and racism, and how those experiences over time accumulate and, increase risk for poor health and accelerated aging. And certainly current events nationally and internationally have really put a spotlight on the importance of this work, and is sort of one of many factors that contribute to the health disparities we see today. So I am, very, very much in the research zone of that kind of work, but I really hope that people will be able to use the work that we're doing to demonstrate, why these issues need to be addressed, and really how policymakers and community activists can leverage what we're learning to enact change.
Asking people questions about such personal matters like their healthcare must be somewhat challenging, just to establish levels of trust with you. Is that something that comes into play with your research? How do you go about finding participants and ensuring that they trust you to keep their information private?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly if you don't have rapport and trust, and if participants don't have confidence that you are taking their material and sensitively and using lots of strict protocols to keep material confidential, that can really limit the quality of data you're able to collect and the true insights you're able to get about, get from families. At the Center for Family Research here at UGA, we have a number of really long-term staff who have really grown up alongside with many of the families who have been participating in our longitudinal studies. And I think that those staff members play an outsized role in our ability to collect accurate and honest information from families, because they know these families on such a personal level, and they know birthdays, they know when something exciting is happening in the family or they're moving, and that trust takes a long time to develop. We do, we try to, with other studies, we try to develop that trust or rapport initially with families when we are conducting maybe structured interviews or observations with families. So a lot of our initial training with research assistants and graduate students is focused on, being sensitive and professional and not reactive to information that they might hear. Because especially for some families, they will have, traumatic experiences or major stressors, and the last thing we want to do is have a reaction that's like, oh my God, or get emotionally involved. But that can be hard sometimes to not react when someone is telling you something personal. So that there's a lot of training that goes into that initially.
Thinking about the training and also about the wide variety of project staff that you're involved with, what are some of the different roles that students could play in research? Everything from perhaps a freshman or sophomore who just is beginning to explore their interest in psychological research, towards perhaps somebody who's graduated with a bachelor's degree or someone in graduate school. What type of different options might they have?
Yeah, I mean, so I am always excited when freshmen and sophomores reach out to us about opportunities to work in the lab, because the ideal scenario is one in which someone joins on, maybe kind of spends a semester learning about different projects, getting involved in a small way, maybe volunteer capacity, but eventually over time develops more skills and is able to take on more of a leadership role with our lab. So our undergraduate RAs will typically work for research credit here at Georgia. sort of the structure we have set up. And for students who take a lot of initiative and demonstrate a lot of responsibility, we will put them in pretty demanding roles of expectations to be in charge of some element of the project, which is, really great training and research experience for someone when they are getting ready to graduate and are maybe looking for a research position or a full-time job before they go to graduate school. So we, in my lab, I also have full-time staff who are typically recent grads who have worked in a lab and demonstrated that sort of responsibility and proficiency. And they'll typically work in our lab for 1 to 2 years, gain some more skills before they go to graduate school. But there are other, for the center where I work, we have a number of full-time staff who are in kind of a long-term project coordinator roles where they might have been involved in studies for a decade connected to the center. The project might change, but they are really kind of the backbone of the work staff and in our group. And those are really valuable people to have on your team because they have a lot of institutional knowledge and direct experience managing large-scale studies. So that would be one route to consider for people who maybe aren't totally sold on getting a PhD or going down the traditional research path, but who want to be involved in research and want to be more hands-on with the research that they're conducting.
If someone has not pursued research, but after perhaps listening to our conversation is inspired, are there certain skills or characteristics or qualities that you're looking for that someone could highlight in a cover letter or their resume, things that perhaps they've experienced through other types of positions that might translate or transfer into a research?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's true that, sometimes people either can't get involved in research or kind of find their love of research a little bit later in school and maybe don't have the opportunity to pursue, years of working in a lab. What I tend to look for, probably in no particular order, I look for someone who's very conscientious and can reply to emails in a timely way, has a demonstrated ability to follow through on projects that they are working on, whether it's in research or any other sort of work context maybe. And then just someone who demonstrates curiosity, because ultimately you will be limited by the kinds of research questions you can think of. So people who come with interesting backgrounds, maybe they worked in a summer camp and, had these really interesting insights into how children interact with each other or family dynamics that they observed. Those kinds of real world experiences or life experiences might not be directly research related, but can be hugely relevant assets to highlight in a cover letter, or, if you're reaching out to a researcher to see if you might be able to get involved.
During the pandemic, certainly it has a lot of ways that it's impacted and changed us. Do you mind talking a little bit more about that, how it's impacted you both personally and professionally?
Yeah, it's hard to overestimate how much of an impact the pandemic has had. Personally, I've been lucky to stay healthy during this period, and trying to stay busy around the house with house projects. And we have a puppy at home, so he keeps us busy for sure. Professionally, it has also been a real challenge because all of our data collection is more or less on hold. Most of our studies involve some blood collection, and so given the risk of infection and vulnerable populations that we're studying, it doesn't feel like the right time to really be out in the field collecting data. We have tried to pivot and work on projects that we can do remotely. So for one of our studies, we checked in with all of the families to find out how things have been going during the quarantine, and sort of during this challenging period, more generally speaking. we have one project that is set to start this fall, and the only reason I feel comfortable about it moving forward is because as part of the study, all of the participants get a flu shot, which remains, very important, and perhaps even more so than normal right now. So, so that study is set to move forward, but with a lot of restrictions in place. Many fewer people that we can see per day, lots of cleaning in between appointments. Everybody's masked and gloved, and a lot of health and cleaning precautions to try to keep everybody safe.
Are there experiences from your own time as a student, whether an undergrad or a grad, that you look to use as inspiration for yourself now as you guide other students?
Yeah, I mean, I think one experience that comes to mind was actually during my postdoc. The study that I was working on was a large project of kids who had asthma and their families, and we were really interested in how social experiences and socioeconomic disadvantage might exacerbate asthma symptoms and some of the biology that underlies the disease. And those families just all had really interesting stories that provided a lot of context for how they were juggling the demands of managing a chronic illness with the demands of everyday life. And one family in particular that really stands out to me was a, really happy, great family that just, that seemed like their child's asthma was well controlled, and they kind of had figured out how to make it all work. And our visits are long, they're a couple hours. We're often, get to chatting along the way. And at one point we were talking about why, what had led the families to find out about the study, why they were participating. And it turned out that a few years prior, the family had lost a child to asthma. And they were really motivated to participate in research so that other families wouldn't have the same experience that they did. And, for me, that really put the whole experience into perspective of why we do this work, that these are real people with real lives, and it is not just numbers in a table. So I do think that those kinds of experiences, working with families and actually hearing about their lived experiences, can be a real source of inspiration and motivation for pursuing the work.
Part of what I hear you saying is that we really need people in research who have lots of different talents and skills. We need the people who can be perhaps more objective and very focused on the numbers, and then we also need people who are very compassionate and can hear the stories behind the numbers, and we need all of those people and more to work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, for me, as a scientist, I really focus on study design and statistical analysis, and, do our interpretations match the data that we've collected? And one piece that I feel like our team currently doesn't have, but I hope in the next 5 to 10 years we'll be able to explore, is more of a translational and advocacy component to the work that we're doing. I'm certainly not prepared and not an expert in that domain, and would feel really, talk about imposter syndrome of trying to be someone you are not. But it does occur to me that we're using taxpayer dollars to study these really important questions. We're learning a lot of really key insights, and often that jump from what we're learning to disseminating to the public is a piece that falls short. And again, it's not for lack of interest. I think it's a lack of time and maybe a lack of expertise on my part of feeling inadequate to be that messenger. And so I do hope, for people who are listening to this and who think, oh, I'm kind of interested in research, but I really want to change the world, partner with researchers who are doing important work, because I tell you what, those people who know how to do advocacy work or know how to do policy relevant work, you guys are the ones who will really change the world. And I would like to be along for the ride in whatever way we can support those efforts.
Well, we're running out of time here, so I just wanted to ask you as a final question to the students who are watching this, What advice might you have as they continue to move forward in the field of psychology?
Well, I think for anyone who is interested in potentially pursuing a research career in psychology, the sooner you can get involved in a research lab, the better, whether it's in a volunteer capacity, paid capacity, research credit. It's never too late to try to find a lab that will take you. Even if the lab that is studying a question you're not as passionate about, that's okay. My undergraduate research was all focused on cognitive aging with older adults, so about as far away from where I ended up as you can get. And if you are sort of nearing the end of your college career or after college, don't worry that you've missed the boat. You might just have to work a little bit harder to either build in those research experiences or find new ways of marketing the experiences you've had to get involved in. And just know that a research career in psychology is really not the only option. You can pursue research that doesn't end up with you as a faculty member. There are a lot of other roles, whether it's in a support role or maybe at a medical school. There's a lot of different opportunities for getting involved.
Thank you so much for spending some time with me talking today. I've really loved hearing about all of your different experiences and your expertise. You certainly bring a lot of passion to the field. So thank you so much.
It's great to be a part of it.